This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a historian specializing in the legal history of the Soviet Union, teaching at Tel Aviv University, and we're here today to discuss one of her major research interests, the trials of Nazi criminals and collaborators in the Soviet Union during and in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Dr. Dina Moyal, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
So let's start with a bit of a background. Can you give us an overview of those trials? How many defendants were they? Where were they from? And what were the charges? And round about what period we're talking about?
Yes, we normally look at trials of war as connected immediately to the events of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, which commenced in 1941 for the Soviets.
It's called the Great Patriotic War. Right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
In Europe, it started in 1939, of course, but the Soviets look at it as their great patriotic war, which is directly connected also to the revolution. This is how I see it. So from their perspective, I believe, these trials are only another stage in their world revolution and their war with different anti-revolutionary forces such as the Germans, Nazis, fascists, etc. So this war essentially began already in the 30s when Hitler came to power and the Soviet Union started to defend itself in various ways to prepare itself to war. So in the 1930s, some say that the show trials of the Stalinist show trials against the Trotskyites, Zinoviev, Kamenev, etc., were already part of this war. Mm-hmm. Of this battle. So we could say that what happened later on during the war and afterwards was another stage in this battle for the Soviets to prove that they were right in this battle.
So for Stalin, Hitler and Trotsky were one of the same in terms of being enemies of the state.
Well, Trotsky was a collaborator, maybe even worse than Hitler, because Trotsky already saw the light. Gilad Halpern, one of the scholars in Tel Aviv University, describes how actually the Bolsheviks were trying to show people the light of revolution. And the worst crime was seeing this light and then going backwards and turning back against the revolution.
Mm-hmm. Against the revolution being anti-Stalinist. Is that what it means, really? What do you mean by saying that Trotsky was a traitor to the cause?
Well, according to the party, right? Mm-hmm. So the party is always right. Sure. The party line. It's part of determinism connected to Marxism, right? So Marx is talking about the revolution as a scientific event. It's part of history, right? So if history turns in a certain way, it's only proof of the practical way it was supposed to develop. Things cannot develop in a different way. So if Stalin was the victor, the leader of the Soviet Union, that means that any person who turns back against him did not see the light, was wrong, etc.
An enemy of history. Exactly. Okay, so we're digressing here a bit, but let's go back to the war itself. So in 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, which invites a backlash from the Soviet army. And then in 1943, the tables start to turn with the Nazi defeat in Stalingrad and the advance of the Soviet army westwards that, again, 2 years later ended up in complete victory. And this is when Nazi collaborators from within Soviet territory, especially in the western provinces, start, as it were, to come out of their holes and are met with justice. Can you tell us a bit about the historical background, the emergence of Nazi collaborators as a phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think we should start here in 1939 with the eve of the war. On August 23rd, 1939, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement is signed between the Soviet Union and Germany, which is a kind of a non-aggression pact, but which had also a secret part, which divided the territory between Germany and the Soviet Union, between these two powers, in case the borders are crossed and some aggression starts. And this is what led the Soviets enter and conquer parts of Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, and Southern. Then in 1941, when Hitler invades, the Soviet Union loses huge territory. Yeah, from center of Poland till almost Moscow, 40 kilometers from Moscow. Leningrad is encircled completely and is under siege for almost 3 years. And this brings a huge number of people under the influence of the Germans. About 25 million people under the influence of the Germans. And for the Soviet Union, all these people, every person who was under German occupation is a potential collaborator. Mm-hmm. Because we have to remember that in 1941, no one knew how things are going to turn out. Mm-hmm. So for the Soviets, not only the Russians are potential collaborators, but obviously Poles, Balts, Ukrainians, people who fought for their independence back in 1917 and during the revolution.
Who were, at the end of the day, more pro-fascist than pro-communist, especially the nationalists among them.
Yeah, exactly. Between the wars, each of the regimes in these countries were actually debating and contemplating what kind of regime they should choose, and the nationalist movement really took hold of these areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're talking about millions of potential collaborators, and at the end of the day, we're talking about a few 100,000 actual collaborators. What did this collaboration consist of?
So, first of all, collaboration could be in different shapes and forms. It could be officials who became part of the German occupation of the system, but it also could be people who were working in German economic organization, factories, even people who helped the Germans reopen Soviet factories or assisted the Germans in finding those people who were collaborating with the Soviets against the Germans. Mm-hmm. So there are different types of forms, even if the Germans were forcing people to do something, unless they really rejected or could prove that they were potential collaborators. And about 5 million people, when the Soviets were moving back westward from 1943 on, they established camps, filtration camps, and were putting there about 5 million people, all in all, to really sift and understand who is against us and who is for us.
Mm-hmm. And before we start describing the actual processes of justice here, let's spend some time discussing what justice actually meant for the Soviets. Because when we think about war trials of Nazi criminals, we think about the Nuremberg trials, about the Eichmann trial, about the Frankfurt trials, and most of it was essentially shaped by Hollywood. What was really the essence of bringing those people to justice? It wasn't because they were committing crimes against humanity and all sorts of lofty ideas like that. As you said in the beginning, it was crimes against the state.
Yeah, so we normally tend to think that Nuremberg trials were part of this Western idea of bringing to trial the Germans and their collaborators. But actually, Francine Hirsch of Wisconsin published recently an article about the role of the Soviets in the Nuremberg trials, revealing that actually the Soviets were the first who were insisting on trials, on show trials, similar to the ones they had in the 30s against their own collaborators with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And one of the legal theorists there, Treinin, published a book calling Crimes Against Peace an International Crime. So that was some say, the original, the basis of this idea.
Interesting.
So in fact, for them, the Soviets tried to establish international criminal law as the basis for these trials, and turning this into crimes against humanity was a way into turning this into an international case.
But did they care at all about crimes against humanity? The fact that the defendants were involved in mass killing and things that were actually we find horrendous, but actually the Soviets didn't care much about.
So one of the paradoxes of the Soviet Union is that they wanted to bring liberation, but did it through coercion. That's one of the...
How do you mean?
So for them, the mission was to bring freedom to humanity, true freedom. Not freedom as if freedom through law, but true freedom that does not need definitions. So for the Soviets, they wanted to create a specific situation in the world. They had a certain aim of socialism, of communism, and they were ready to give sacrifices on the way. For the West, as I see it, we normally think about law as a machine, and we build it in a certain way to produce best results. And we focused on the way it should work. Mm. And if it works correctly, properly, then we should accept the result. So our focus is on the processes, on the rights of victims, of the state, of the process itself. For the Soviets, they focus on the result. That's why when they see that the result is fraud, if we see a German who was killing people, given certain rights, but then as a result does not accept responsibility for crimes, they would say that's not legitimate.
Which is, again, paradoxical because, as you say, in the West, we look at justice as a more procedural thing, and the Soviets were more concerned, more preoccupied with justice, which, again, turns everything we know on its head.
Exactly.
So tell us a bit about how the trials started, and really how did this principle just described that, the way the Soviets understood justice was put into practice.
Yeah. So we have to remember that, of course, some of the executions took place outside court and without any legal procedures. So after certain battles, it's totally possible that Soviet soldiers executed German soldiers that just lost the battle. But normally, when Soviet authorities got to the area, they gathered German soldiers and gathered their judges in a central place in a city. There were trials taking place in Kharkov, for example, in 1943, and they would have their prosecution investigate the case. They had a special commission which investigated abuses of German occupation, and they would help bring the evidence, and then had a trial in one of the central buildings where they also invited the public. And then normally these trials were really speedy trials. It took a day, 2 days, 3 max, and then most of them were executed. Not all of them publicly.
Are we talking about Germans or local collaborators?
This is for Germans.
Okay.
Yeah, that's for German soldiers or officials.
Prisoners of war.
Prisoners of war. Normally more highly ranked than regular soldiers. There weren't many public executions. These executions were performed mainly in order to show the population.
Propaganda purposes.
Yeah, exactly. To show the population. So first of all, that the Soviets are winning, to show the Germans that they should be afraid of what's going to happen to them. So these executions were public. Together with them, there were executions of local population. Was tried, not always in the same trials, but different trials, for collaborating with the enemy.
And what did this collaboration really consist of? What justified being tried for collaboration, perhaps being executed?
Actually, it's interesting that many of the cases, at least those I read, had to do with abuses of local population and in many cases Jewish population. This did not figure almost in any way in the trials. So the prosecutor could say that they were Soviet citizens of the Jewish nationality. But other than that, the crimes and prosecution were according to regular Soviet law. But the descriptions are really horrific. of the German or Romanian soldiers, forces coming in to villages and then asking local population to collaborate with them to get the Jews. And the stories are terrible, of gathering Jews, people knowing their neighbors and leading them to a certain wooden house, burning them alive, killing Jews in rivers, and then dumping them in a certain pit in the woods. So the stories are really suit the narratives we used to hear of the Holocaust. Of the Holocaust. I would say that people who were involved in killing were executed, most of them. Other collaborators in different shapes or forms were tried and then sent to the gulags for 10 years, 20 years of imprisonment. So,
were any of them acquitted?
A tiny minority, and it was a very rare case. In most cases, and this is true to many of the Soviet legal proceedings, what could be done is to lower, to diminish the punishment, but acquittals were rare.
Right. The interesting thing, again, about these trials is that they went on until the 1980s. What can you tell us about the evolving nature of bringing those people to justice after the immediate aftermath of the Second World War? I mean, from the late 50s onwards.
Yeah, I think this has to do in general with the way the Soviet legal system worked. So because they were interested in the result of a case and not in the proceedings, in the Soviet Union there were practically unlimited number of appeals one could submit. And especially if new evidence came. So a person could be tried for the same crime again if there were new evidence. And since the Soviets were really interested to know the truth, and that was the purpose of the trial, then if new evidence came, in the 80s, people could be tried again. So I would say this is part of the idea. Of course, there are political changes which influenced these trials already in the 40s or late 40s. When the Soviets came back to the area, we could see that the idea of the trial and finding the perpetrators was also an affair between neighbors in certain cities. So someone couldn't accuse of someone else of being a collaborator just for the purpose of getting rid of a neighbor or someone who's not getting along with. And the Soviets were aware of that and trying and invited people to give more evidence and to understand the real situation there.
Well, this is very interesting, Dr. Dina Moyal, but I'm afraid this is where we'll have to wrap up. You're a historian specializing in the legal history of the Soviet Union, and you're teaching at Tel Aviv University. So thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about trials of Nazi criminals and collaborators in the Soviet Union. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
אני מטומטם, הכי יפה בעולם. חשבתי שאני רואה יותר מדי, אולי השיר